Last week we learned how to manipulate sentences involving the universal quantifier with the universal quantifier rules. This week we're going to talk about how to manipulate sentences involving the existential quantifier using rules designed to manipulate the existential quantifier. For ease of recording, I have broken this lecture up into several parts. Let's begin talking about our first rule, the rule of existential introduction. The rule of existential introduction is relatively easy to grasp. So consider the following argument. Socrates is human, therefore something is human. If we represent this argument in the symbolism of predicate logic, it comes out as follows. HS, therefore, there is an x such that hx. It's apparent, I think, that this argument is valid. And the rule of existential introduction allows us to prove that this argument is valid. So here is a statement of the rule. Suppose one has a line containing a sentence that contains a name. One may infer from that line a new line which is exactly like it, except that one or more occurrences of that name have been uniformly replaced by a variable, and an existential quantifier which ranges over that variable has been placed out front. Okay, the rule is a mouthful, but the rule itself is pretty easy to work with. Let's look at an example. So here is the example we just considered, or the sequent we just considered. HS, therefore there exists an x such that hx. So we write down our premise, and then the rule of existential introduction allows us to infer from our premise the existential claim that we're trying to derive. So we started with HS. We applied the rule of existential introduction. In so doing, we took the name S that occurred in the sentence on line 1 and we replaced it with the variable x, and we put an existential quantifier out front that ranges over that variable. And now we're done. Okay, let's look at a slightly more complicated example. So consider this sentence. For any x, if x is h, then x is m. S is h, therefore something is m. So this could stand for the argument all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore something is mortal. I think this argument is clearly valid, and the rules we have allow us to prove that it is. So we begin by writing down our premises. Now, the first line, as it currently is, isn't all that useful to us, but we can make it useful to us by applying the rule of universal elimination. And so we turn this in, we take what we had on line 1 and we generate a new line that now has sub-sentences involving the name S. And that's a good thing, because now that we've got lines 2 and 3, we can apply modus ponens to those lines to get MS. And then once we have MS, we can apply the rule of existential introduction to get our desired conclusion. Okay, so before I move on to the next part of this lecture, I want to note that the rule of existential introduction is sometimes called the rule of existential generalization. That's something that you should be aware of in case you encounter this rule in other places besides this class. But in this class we'll refer to it as the rule of existential introduction. In the next part of the lecture we'll talk about another rule for the existential quantifier, the rule of existential elimination.